Good morning, everybody. My name is Jonathan Elkind. I am a senior research scholar with the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and we are delighted to have you all with us today for our program on the impact of Canada's election on the global energy transition. It's one element of a new program of rapid response events that we are doing as webinars at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and we hope that you will find today's discussion useful and informative. I'd offer three thoughts as we start our program today. First, like many citizens of the United States, I can say that I've had a long affection and a deep respect for my country's northern neighbor, that being Canada. That doesn't mean that I could pretend to be any great expert on Canadian affairs, on its history, its politics, society, or economy. I've traveled there a lot to visit dear friends, and more recently to visit a son who lives in Vancouver, a marvelous place. And in my professional life, I've had lots of opportunity to collaborate with outstanding Canadian officials, scholars, and business people. But still, I'm not an expert. I'm a student of Canada. Second point, earlier this year, like many in my country, I was surprised and candidly disappointed when the President of the United States issued repeated and in some cases actually offensive comments about Canada, its sovereignty and independence. Relations between our countries, countries that have lived side by side and in peace and in deep interconnection since the mid-19th century, all of a sudden those relations turned tense. In energy terms, our focus for the conversation today, Canada is a global leader with energy goods and services amounting to roughly 1/3 of the country's total exports. The relationship in energy with the United States is massive. It covers electricity, where there are flows in both directions. Canada actually is the world's largest electricity exporter. And just to put some numbers on that, in the year 2023, that amounted to 52 terawatt hours of power exported to the United States, along with about 17 terawatt hours exported from the United States north to Canada, mostly in the Pacific Northwest region. And that was a year when hydropower production was impacted by drought conditions. Our electrical systems, both south and north of the border, operate under the shared rules of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, which attests to this particularly close electricity relationship. To look at crude oil and refined products, Canada is the world's fourth largest producer as of 2023. 92% of its exports flow from Canada to the United States. U.S. refineries, particularly through the Great Lakes region and the Rocky Mountains region, are designed in order to be optimized for Canadian grades of crude. And those imports of crude oil from Canada represent 60% of total U.S. imports. And in fact, this has given rise to one of the topics I imagine that we'll discuss here in a few minutes, which is the adequacy of export infrastructure from Canada to reach markets other than the United States. It would be a mistake only to focus on the conventional energy systems. Collaborations on next generation energy policies and technologies are also very important between the United States and Canada. In fact, California and Quebec have integrated their emissions trading systems so that within the two compliance markets that those represent, one can trade an avoided ton in one for a ton in the other. And as one final example that I'll mention in introducing this, one can look at the announcement just about a week ago that Ontario Power had given the green light to the construction of the first of what may be as many as four of the GE Hitachi designed BWRX 300 technologies, a new generation of nuclear reactors for power production. That leads me to my third and last point for framing. In Canada, a new national figure has emerged onto the stage, not somebody who is a complete unknown, but somebody who people knew from other lines of work, other very distinguished roles in the worlds of global finance and the macroeconomy. Mark Carney became the leader of the Liberal Party and the acting prime minister in March in the wake of Justin Trudeau's decision to step down from that post. Carney then won election on April 28th and will serve as the prime minister for, if I understand properly, here's where the student part comes in, as many as 4 years into the future. So for our program today, we're going to focus on the impact of Canada's election on energy issues and the global energy transition. For this purpose, I am delighted to be joined by two of my distinguished colleagues from the Center on Global Energy Policy, Dr. Robert Johnston, who you'll hear me refer to as RJ, is the center's Senior Director for Research. Dr. Chris Bataille, who is a CGEP Global Fellow, joins us actually from that marvelous city I referred to earlier, Vancouver. We had hoped also to be joined today by Sarah Bianchi, a distinguished visiting fellow with the center, and we're very sorry that a last-minute family matter did not permit that to happen. So, RJ, let me kick off by kind of talking a little bit about getting you guys to talk a little bit about the politics that is unfolding in Canada. You had an op-ed piece, that ran in the weeks leading up to the election, in which you talked about the historical nature of the Canadian economy with a more resource heavy politics in the west of Canada, a more manufacturing oriented economy in the east of Canada, and the need for unity in this time of some unparalleled tensions with the United States. Take us through that argument, if you would, please, and your sense of where the politics of Canada is in relation to energy at this time.
Thanks, John, and thanks for that very detailed introduction. You've obviously spent your share of time in Ottawa and Calgary and other such places keeping track of these issues. So yeah, there's lots to talk about on the Canadian side. For those who don't know, I am a Canadian who's lived and worked in the U.S. for the last 30 years or so. And over the course of those 30 years in the U.S., Canada hasn't come up that often. I mean, Keystone XL was a thing for a while. Elections come and go, hockey showdowns, things like that. But for the most part, we've been out of the news, and sometimes we feel like we're unappreciated for all the energy contributions that you mentioned, John, your comments. But maybe it's a case of watch what you wish for, because I never thought that Canada would be so much in the news here in the U.S. and that we would be a geopolitical hotspot in the way that things have played out over the last 100 days or so. So that's the landscape that Prime Minister Carney will have to deal with. And in terms of the piece that you mentioned that I wrote in the Hub, the idea was very much that whoever won that now complete election would have the economy as the core issue to deal with, an economy that would have to tackle a few challenges, certainly responding to the tariff threat from the United States, whether that was through USMCA or some other new security and economic framework. It would also be a question of how to improve productivity in Canadian manufacturing, which has sort of been slipping over the last 10 or 20 years. And not just the competitive threat from the US, but especially from Asia, Asian manufacturing. And then thirdly, what is the role of Canada's traditional natural resources sector, its oil and gas sector in particular, in a world that seems to oscillate between energy security and climate change concerns, for depending on what's happening in the geopolitical landscape. So that's a pretty full plate for Carney. And I think the idea of you have to look at all these issues almost as being connected, right? That our manufacturing industry can leverage the energy and natural resources sector, whether it's low cost electricity and natural gas, in many cases zero carbon electricity like nuclear power in Ontario, to attract manufacturers that want that resource. Our natural gas in the West can be the basis for an expansion of our petrochemical industry. There's critical mineral development opportunities, not just for things like batteries for electric vehicles and long duration storage, but for other critical mineral intensive sectors like defense and high tech, which are getting more and more important here as well. Um, and all of that is especially urgent. It was urgent before, but even more so now, with the threat of the Trump administration's tariffs. Now, that does seem to have eased a little bit in the last few weeks. I'm sure we'll talk about that more. But nonetheless, it was a wake-up call, and I think we'll sort of reinforce this urgent agenda to get the two pillars of our economy, the manufacturing in the East and the natural resources in the West, going at all speed ahead.
Thanks for that. And I realize that I omitted a couple of quick points of housekeeping, which I'll just do. And then, Chris, I'd like to come to you for your perspective on that kind of top level situation in the politics. Item number one, we very much look forward to questions from the audience. Please use the chat function to send those to us. And I'll be selecting as many as we can get to in the latter part of the program. We're going to continue this discussion right now, kind of centering around the politics. We'll then switch to discussion focusing a bit more on some of the conventional energy development and energy trade issues, and then spend the third part looking at a complex of issues in the clean energy space. So that's the plan going forward. And Chris, I wonder if you have any comments you want to throw into the mix there about the broad politics at this moment in Canada when it comes to energy.
Yeah, sure. Um, I'm a little bit of a student of economic history and of Canada and the globe in general. And what we're seeing right now is not all that new. We've lived through a generation and a half of sort of trade peace and a clear picture of how we interrelate to the United States. But since Confederation and even before that, Canada, it's a settler colony, what have you. It's been very short on capital. It's been short on labor. The one thing we've had in abundance is energy and natural resources. So the card we played has always been energy and natural resources in order to get investment, and then labor comes in and you get investment and the whole thing starts building. And that's a fair picture of our history right through to the 1950s. And we've gone through phases of lots of tariffs with the United States, none. There were tariffs that basically forced all trade to go east and west across Canada, and that caused a lot of tensions from Western Canada with the manufacturing hubs in Eastern Canada because they were forced to pay higher prices, right? So we're kind of, unfortunately, this tariff situation has brought us back to the situation of, what do we do about interprovincial trade and trade across Canada as opposed to trade with the United States, which is actually the more natural economic relationship, if not the political relationship, given our history. Just going forward, the election was one of the most exciting ones in generations. Carney, the Conservatives were ahead by 20 plus points over the course of a few months. The Liberals turned that around with Trudeau resigning, Carney coming in, and there was speculation, would he get a majority, which in Canadian terms means he will govern for just short of 5 years, or he got a minority, which is just 2 seats short of a majority, and he's going to need seats from partners, be it the Bloc Québécois or the NDP, to hold that government together. And talking to people here, people think he can hold this together for at least 3 years, if not more. But with minority governments, it's always a roll of the dice.
So I'd like to get you all to comment a little bit more on the degree of unity or fragmentation in Canada's politics at this time. I think a lot of people have commented, and Chris, you just highlighted this, or you both just highlighted this, that the the tensions with the United States in some ways drove a very clear change in the expected electoral outcomes. Yet nonetheless, there are still some very different perspectives that exist across Canada. RJ, you and I were together in 2023 in Calgary, where we heard lots of dismay and disappointment or frustration directed at Ottawa for the policies of Justin Trudeau's government. So, to what extent is fragmentation a real and uh, uh, problematic challenge for this new government, or is that easy to overblow?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a significant challenge because you're right that the situation with the U.S. did sort of support a Team Canada unification approach in many ways over the first few months that it occurred. But what the election has left us with is sort of the same situation we've had in the last previous three elections, which is a Liberal government in Ottawa with almost no representation in the major resource producing provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan, which have voted more on the Conservative side, to the point that you only really have 3 or 4 MPs from the Liberal side in those two provinces out of I don't know 100 plus, almost 100 seats. So that lack of balance creates maybe perhaps an insecurity and a um, difficulty of connecting the prioritization that those provinces place on traditional natural resources into the Ottawa system under the Liberals. It's not that Liberals haven't made efforts in various ways, and it's not that uh, Alberta and Saskatchewan haven't reached out in different ways, but they haven't really been able to have breakthrough on some of the major issues. So now you would say, well, those are energy sector issues. How does that rise to the national unity question? And I think the debate now is that whereas national unity was always really a sort of French English issue in the past with Quebec, now those Western provinces, particularly Alberta, some voters there will feel like the system will never change in their favor and that they won't be able to get enough representation in Ottawa to achieve the goals that they have for the natural resources sector in particular, but on some other issues as well, like equalization payments between the provinces. So some of those folks are arguing that there should be a referendum in Alberta to determine whether Alberta should become, independent from the rest of Canada. So yes, the national unity is strong because of what's happened in the U.S., but the election in Canada has sort of led up for the fourth election in a row this result where there's a regional imbalance, which is driving some unity concerns as well, particularly in the West.
Got it. Okay. Maybe let's now shift the focus a little bit to the energy sector itself, and first to talk a little bit about some of the conventional energy development and energy trade dimensions of the conversation. Um, you've both commented on the Chris, you said kind of a north to south and south north trade in some ways was a natural outcome that one could expect given the physical geography of Canada. There's that 92% figure for the share of Canadian crude oil that is exported to the United States. Um, uh, to what extent do you anticipate that Canada's export infrastructure may start to look different with much more greater emphasis on east-west infrastructure that allows oil and natural gas to be brought to either the Pacific or the Atlantic coasts going forward? RJ, you want to start us off there?
Yeah, no, I think both Chris and I spent a long time looking at these issues over the last couple of decades, and um, I think the main focus, in my view, has been primarily on the West. That's where that a lot of action has been, getting the higher growth markets in Asia Pacific, both for oil and gas. So there's been some success there with the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion through Burnaby on the Pacific coast, as well as the LNG Canada project backed by Shell and other companies in northern British Columbia, which will take natural gas in liquefied form to Asia. However, I think that's not viewed as sufficient by Alberta in particular, And there's as many as 4 or 5 other LNG projects that could go on the West Coast. And there's appetite for 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 more oil pipelines, possibly to the West Coast, to get to those sort of high growth Asia Pacific markets, but also potentially to the east to support Eastern Canadian refineries and maybe move into Atlantic Basin refineries. And also, of course, always more pipeline capacity going to Pad 3 and the Gulf Coast of the US, which is where Keystone XL was supposed to go, but we know that wasn't built. So now maybe there'll be some other pipeline expansions. The pipelines to the US are not that contentious, but there is the uncertainties around trade there. On the West Coast, there's a tanker ban in place that the Trudeau government put in place. There's been Indigenous opposition to some of those projects. And there have been big cost overruns on the Coastal GasLink and Trans Mountain project because these are not easy places to build pipelines as well. And to some, at least, questions about the longer term demand for a 30-year project to feed into Asian oil and gas. Going east, the problem there is that some of the legacy pipelines go through the U.S. from Canada through the U.S. and back into Canada, which in a world of unrestricted trade is fine. But now, obviously, some questions about that. But there could be a sort of national unity case to move a new pipeline like the Energy East proposal that would take Alberta crude and Saskatchewan crude directly to those kind of Ontario and Quebec and East Coast refineries. So there's a lot in the menu, and we're just to see where Prime Minister Carney comes down in terms of what projects among that portfolio he wants to prioritize.
There's another thing too, right? Where the Canadians oil has historically sold at a discount, $10 to $20 per barrel, because typically both the quality of the crude and the supply was always slightly ahead of demand heading into the US. So going into the US, Canadian producers often were getting $20 a barrel less. The key value of that pipeline that was put out to the West Coast, TMX, which was tripled from 300,000 barrels a day to 900,000 maximum once they figure out the draft of the boats and what have you, is it allowed that discount to come up. It went from 20 to 15 to 10, has been even smaller. So what's been happening is just the per barrel margins have gotten a lot better with those exports out to the West Coast. So that one relatively small pipeline has had a big impact on the fiscal returns to Alberta, to the oil and gas producers and to the Alberta provincial government.
Got it. And I'd be interested, Chris, maybe this one to you first. Having spent time in Vancouver, as I mentioned, I've gotten an impression of the degree of controversy that exists around some of the new capacity on the Pacific Coast. Can you talk a little bit about what your expectations might be about, the degree of difficulty to increase that capacity and the permitting issues and the First Nation issues and so forth? Is that a super heavy lift, a heavy lift that is surmountable, or something other?
Yeah, okay, so I'm a longtime Vancouverite. The tripling of the capacity at Westport for TMX is behind 2 bridges and in a fjord in tidal waters, and there was a lot of concern that there was potential for more accidents. So they put more Coast Guard in, what have you. But there is a lot of worry about increasing the crude, especially dilbit, because it doesn't float on, like it tends to drop to the bottom. If it pours out, it doesn't float on the surface like standard crude oil, which is easier to clean up. So
Will you just say a word on what dilbit
oh
is?
yeah, sorry. Okay, so typically the Alberta oil sands, when they're shipped down a pipeline, they're a mix of high quality synthetic crude oil, which is made, at one of the big integrating facilities or at a merchant upgrader. And what it does is acts as a diluent or almost like a solvent to allow bitumen to, you mix it with bitumen and then you can send it down to pipe all the way to Chicago and to Oklahoma and what have you. And it doesn't need a lot of heat and what have you. So dilbit is a mixture of really low quality oil and really high quality oil so that it pours well. But the problem is if you have a marine accident, it's a bit of a nightmare. So I think there's going to be quite a bit of resistance to moving more oil out of the West Coast. Obviously they'll take good care. There's a lot less resistance to LNG, because quite simply, if you have an LNG tanker incident, the gas goes up, you maybe have a fire, what have you, but you don't have these, ecosystem endangering kind of spills. So, I think it's going to be difficult to get more oil pipelines to the West Coast. I think they'll be able to maximize the TMX port, and because it's in place. But it will be a difficult discussion between the resistance of the local communities, the city, the local communities, the provincial government, the First Nations, what have you. But LNG doesn't face anywhere near that resistance. And I should comment, like, the political divide in Canada is much like the US. It's not so much regional as urban rural, right? So if you scrape away that top layer, most of our cities lean very heavily one way, including Calgary and Edmonton, right? Like they're much what we call redder. It's the opposite of the US. Whereas, in Vancouver, you drive east about 50 kilometers, you're deep into conservative territory after having left liberal territory. So we're very much an urban rural divide society, much like a lot of the politics in the US.
Well, I'll just express the hope that across that urban-rural divide, Canadians are doing better than Americans in finding ways to discover common ground, because I think that's quite important. Let's shift to electricity, if I could. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, it's a hugely important part of the total energy relationship and the trading relationship between the United States and Canada. But trade in electricity really at a very, very literally moment by moment basis is built on trust. So I'd be interested in your views about the degree to which that trust between the United States and Canada um, may be a now much more difficult factor going forward. Does the experience of the last 100+ days recede into memory, get kind of treated as that was a bad moment, but things are now moving toward a calmer zone? Or is trust impacted in a meaningful way that could express itself in the electric power sector going forward?
I think time will tell, obviously. I would say for the most part, it's trust has been dented but not broken. And I do think that, as you know, John, the sort of idea of a North American Electricity Reliability Council, right? That's looking at the whole region, all the interconnects, how the different markets fit together, is built around the idea that you want to be able to bring electricity across the border when needed, because of weather or outages, demand spikes, supply loss, whatever the case may be. And so there is a stronger together framework that has governed electricity historically. It did get sort of politicized and weaponized in the early days of the trade tensions here. But I think Prime Minister Carney will look at this from a different perspective, which is to step back and say, if Canada has an abundance of clean electricity, is the best ROI on that resource to send it to the US, or is it to leverage it in Canada to attract data centers or to attract electricity intensive manufacturing, or to electrify, carbon intensive sectors, which we know, from his own record, he's a very climate focused political leader. So I think that debate will be interesting as well, and that the idea that it should just necessarily be automatically exported to the US will not necessarily be given, right? I think there will be a real look at interprovincial trade barriers, right? Chris mentioned that sort of north-south versus east-west geography. That's very true, that you have sort of provincially controlled grids that aren't always as interconnected as they could be across Canada. And are there opportunities there to move, for example, um, zero emissions electricity from British Columbia into Alberta, where the grid is more carbon intensive, but there's also a lot of electricity load growth. What about Ontario and Quebec interconnect, or in the east as well? So I think that will be a topic that we'll look at closely. At the same time, it does, as we know in our work at CGEP, it does look like the U.S. will have its own electricity demand growth, and whether that's filled by Canadian electricity or by Canadian gas going into U.S. power plants remains to be seen. But there certainly will be opportunities south of the border as well.
Yeah, I'd add electricity is one of those things that, you've got to use it or lose it, right? It's really expensive to store, right? So they, with the coming era of more and more wind and solar on the grid, you're going to have areas with surplus and areas with deficit, and there's a really strong incentive to move it around the given transmission network you're in. So BC and California have a strong incentive to trade. California, Quebec and New York have a very strong incentive to trade. However, I do think there's going to be a push to diversify because we're always going to want to trade with the US. It just makes so much economic sense. But, given what's happened and the possibility it could happen with future administrations, there's going to be, okay, we'll do this because it really is worth a lot to us, but we're also going to do this just kind of as a backup. Like Hydro-Quebec going forward will want to sell to New York, but could also invest some of its electricity with that, as it adds wind and what have you to keep the dams full. It could use it to reduce its high quality iron ore to reduced iron, which it can then sell as a high quality product, put it on a boat and sell it to Europe, or even sell it to China, right? So there are other options there, and diversification, I think, is going to be a key strategy.
Thank you very much. Let me just hit one of the questions that has come in from the audience. And again, I remind people to please feel free to put your questions into the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. There's a question about and here I jump back to oil and gas. How do you see the federal energy project permitting regulations developing in the future, changing or staying the same in Canada? Any thoughts on that?
Well, Chris, I'm sure you may have views as well, but I think my perspective would be that Prime Minister Carney will have a choice between reforming the Impact Assessment Act, which is sort of the governing frame for major project assessments in natural resources, repealing it entirely or reforming it. I think they're more likely to reform and try to create a clear kind of single window permitting model, one project, one review model for major infrastructure like transmission lines, like pipelines, like LNG projects, like big critical minerals mines. But the details of that are going to be difficult. And the one thing that stands out to me is that I think Canada's done a really good job on, can always be better, but there's been a lot of progress made on sort of economic reconciliation with our First Nations. And I think that the Impact Assessment Act, for all its flaws, did take that on board and make that a priority. And I think they're going to want to keep that as much in place as possible. So can you strike the balance between a more streamlined permitting process while still treating the First Nations as full partners in these projects is I think going to be the goal. And I think industry does support that, but the details of how that plays out are going to be quite interesting to watch.
Yeah, to add to what RJ just said, I think one of the biggest things we did for speeding up permitting in Canada was to bring in First Nations right at the beginning, right? And with the assumption that they'd be equity partners and what have you. And that completely changes the dynamics of the whole conversation thereafter. We've got a lot of work to do to sort of streamline our layers and layers of permitting through the provinces, through the feds and what have you. But that was one of the biggest things we could do to really shorten and pull out the conflict and acrimony out of the process.
Yeah, that's a good point too. This is one of the paradoxical moments where taking greater care about process shortens rather than lengthens the decision making. Let's now shift the lens to more around the kind of clean energy set of technologies and policies. I guess I'd like to start by asking you both for your views on the decision by Prime Minister Carney to end the consumer carbon tax, which was a decision that he took when he was acting Prime Minister. And clearly that tapped into a great degree of public concern about that instrument. Maybe you might have some thoughts on whether that concern was understandable or to some degree surprising. But now the question is, what next? There is discussion about an industrial carbon tax still coming along. There's the proposal for a cap on emissions from the oil and gas industries. There's talk about a carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM. What do you see coming next in the emissions control space and the policy environment in Canada for climate mitigation? Who wants to kick off?
Chris, you want to
RJ,
go first on this one?
yeah, sure. Um, first of all, we have to clarify what carbon pricing Canada had before all the latest combulations. So we had an upstream industrial emissions pricing. It was an output-based allocation system. I won't try to get into the details of that, but basically, if a facility was over 25,000 tons of CO2 per year, it was in that system, and if you're at 10,000, you could opt in to be in that system. And it was intensity based. They paid a high carbon price on a small portion of their emissions, but it's averaged through the whole base. So they actually paid a relatively low carbon price through their average. And the whole reason we had this complicated system was for competitiveness reasons with the United States. We just couldn't afford to raise our policy too high over U.S. climate, the U.S. prices. The other policy, and that one's been relatively not controversial, right? Like it looked like the Conservatives might remove it if they'd won a majority, but it was relatively uncontroversial. The one that attracted all the fire was the requirement to all the provinces to have the equivalent of a carbon price on all emissions for households, for households, for small firms, what have you, and that was rising in a schedule through time. And the economists will all tell you that this is the most effective way to do this because it gives consumers and small firms the choice of what to do. But the problem is it puts a nameplate price on things, right? And in a time when you've got high inflation, people are kind of on the margin with affordability. It just started attracting a lot of lightning, and it was weaponized during the election. And that's just a reality. And there is a question how effective carbon pricing is for households specifically, like what car I buy, how much I drive it, and what fuel system, what heating system, and cooling system I have in my house. And there is some research indicating that perhaps carbon pricing is not the most effective thing there, that you need subsidies, that you need regulations, and you need to change building codes and standards and what have you, and just require people to buy plug-in hybrids, and then zero emissions vehicles on a long schedule, right? Where carbon pricing is really effective, though, is once you hit smaller firms and then gradually larger and larger firms, because they can see it in their accounting exactly what it's doing, and it does change their behavior. So relatively little effect right at the household, but it gets stronger and stronger effects as you go above. Now, Carney the policy is still in place, but he zeroed it as soon as he took the prime ministership, and that was probably key to him getting elected because it just removed a lightning rod from his campaign. So there's that, and I'm sure RJ's got some other perspectives on it. But the oil and gas cap is super interesting because what it does is it plays off federal jurisdiction, which is over emissions, not production. The provinces get to decide how much they're going to produce or what they're going to permit, right? The feds come in when a pipeline has to cross a provincial boundary, and especially if it leaves the country. So what the oil and gas emissions cap, the needle it was trying to thread was, can we cap emissions, but then allow production to proceed as follow and set up a strong incentive structure to reduce emissions on a per barrel basis produced. Now, there's a politics emerging there where people are calling it a production cap. It's not a production cap, it's emissions cap. But within that, you can also reduce fugitive emissions. You can electrify your conventional oil, all the pumping, the compressors, the battery heating, what have you. It's going to be difficult to electrify oil sands just because of the fast, hard steam needs that are needed immediately to make that work. But there are a lot of options to reduce the GHG intensity of upstream oil and gas production in Canada. And it's quite feasible. The policy from a technocratic point of view is quite sophisticated, and I think it's a good idea. But the question is, will it survive our politics? And I'm sure RJ's got some insightful things to say on that.
Yeah, I think Chris, between you and I, we could cover this one in great detail. But I think I would just add 2 points to your analysis, which is great. I think the first is that I like what you said about the combination between subsidies, regulation, and carbon pricing, and I think that added a layer of complexity for business, especially when you bring in a federal provincial overlay that made it hard to sometimes uh, understand the full cost and full direction of complying with not just a federal industrial carbon price, but with a clean fuel standard, clean electricity regulation, and these other sort of layers that came in, including the permitting process. So that was a big challenge. Another one that's more on the political side is that the Trudeau government had a very ambitious program, very Paris Agreement aligned, net zero 2050. And because oil and gas is the largest source of emissions, that was going to be front and center. It played into the sort of national unity regional politics that we mentioned earlier. But I think where it really fell short was that Canada was just so far ahead of the rest of the oil and gas producing world. Right? If you looked around the world to find other oil and gas jurisdictions that were moving as quickly as Canada was towards all the policies that you mentioned, they were hard to find. Okay, maybe a little bit in Norway, a little bit here, a little bit there. But as far as like the big markets, especially the US, with whom Western Canada is competing for capital, we got in front of that. Now, you can debate whether or not that's the right thing for the climate, but from a political perspective, to your point, it created a real difficult story, I think, not just in Western Canada, but with some, centrist voters across the country. So I think Carney tapped the brakes. I think they're going to look at this whole thing again, try to make it more simple, and then do some benchmarking to figure out where the Canadian oil and gas sector should be and the energy sector more broadly versus other similar jurisdictions around the world.
Well, but RJ, you put your finger on what a point that I really want to kind of push a little bit. So, Canada sits next to an economy that is, orders of magnitude 10 times as large, population 10 times as large, plus minus. Um, uh, and now a policy orientation in Washington, the city where I sit, that is decidedly skeptical, I would say even perhaps unfriendly to climate mitigation as a priority policy pursuit. So where does that leave Canada in terms of I get the value you were expressing of simplifying the policy instruments that are being used. But is it a zero-sum game? I mean, there have been pullbacks in terms of investments in some of the carbon capture and storage projects. How do you see this unfolding and going forward from here?
Yeah, it's going to be a difficult balance to strike because I think that the previous government opted many elements of a European style climate policy, but Europe's not a major oil and gas or natural resource producing region. Uh, but it was be changed in that direction. But it's also not going to go towards a US style model, especially sort of the current administration's model. So I think Carney will try to stay aligned with the Paris Agreement. I think the simplification of policy as much as possible, and maybe the flattening of the curve of some of these goals in terms of like how quickly you move to and implement an emissions cap in oil and gas. You could start it a little bit later and have the decline come a little bit more slowly, for example, that might align with the likely pace of transition and the development of alternative technologies. That's probably where the middle ground is going to be. But I think Canada has to find a space between the poles of kind of EU fit for 55 net zero post carbon economy and the energy dominant sort of US, resurgence of Joel Baby Joel and fossil fuels that we're seeing under the current administration. I don't think Cardin will be in either one of those camps. Maybe his historical ties are more towards the European model, but I think as prime minister and as an economist and central banker, he's gonna be a lot more pragmatic and trying to find, especially when you add those national unity type considerations, that more pragmatic middle position. So we'll see how that plays out.
Chris, I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, Canada is the product of an endless series of grand bargains between regions and populations and what have you, right? And we've been through this many times, and we've always found a place to proceed. My guess is that we arrive at a place where, specifically for energy, we do all, let's do the cheap stuff. Let's do the cheap, high impact stuff. Like, let's work on our fugitive emissions. We've already made commitments to that. Electrify what we can. Apply CCS where it makes really good sense, such as hydrogen making for merchant upgraders and integrated, oil sands operations, what have you. But as RJ says, I think we got to tap the brakes on the really expensive stuff, the stuff that's sort of right on the bleeding edge. I'd love to see Canada part of some, pilot, like my specialty is industrial decarbonization. Be lovely if we have some near zero emissions cement plants, steel making, what have you. But the oil and gas sector, I think, in the interest of national unity, we do the cheap stuff, we do it together, we have a long run plan. It's hard, but I think we really do have to get our provinces at the table, and how does this all fit together? How does this all make sense in this new world we've found ourselves in?
Chris, to your
So
point, I'm glad you mentioned that about steel because I think Carney probably will support a CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism. He said he would during the campaign, and that's where there is opportunity to align with the EU, with or without the US, on decarbonization of the heavy industry sectors that you cover, the aluminum and steel and smelting and petrochemicals and fertilizer. So I'll be interested to see how that plays out, and that could be an opportunity to tailor make a policy, where Canada actually would align with Europe potentially from a policy perspective.
but is that a tricky bit of navigation to do, given that Europe may be ambitious but isn't particularly near at hand, whereas the United States happens to be that obnoxious neighbor next door that keeps having loud parties? How do you see the politics of that, the cross-border politics of that, of a
Well,
Canadian
it
CBAM?
fits with I like the phrase trade hedging rather than trade diversification because I agree with what Chris said earlier. Like the U.S. is the dominant market, the geography, the economic integrations. It's hard to shift from that completely, but one can imagine that if you did want to hedge and open up more trade with Europe, where we do have a free trade agreement, aligning with European standards on methane and on carbon intensity for industrial materials could be an opportunity. So, Chris, I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think the key thing part of this is the industrial pricing system, right? Because what it allows us to do is say that, for these highly, GHG intense, highly traded products like steel and what have you, we have a carbon price in place and these advanced programs. And that gives us sort of reciprocity with the EU CBAM, and our products should be able to flow back and forth. And that's the place I think where we can cooperate with the Europeans most effectively. We'll probably end up with a CBAM on a limited set of products. It won't be as ambitious as some might like, but I think it's going to, this is the question that came up in the last administration. We've got to find a place. What do we do with highly traded GHG intense stuff like petrochemical feedstocks, with steel, but potentially with clinker, with aluminum, with ammonia, and fertilizers, what have you. We need to come to some agreement how we all treat that, and we just need a framework to start with, and we can tighten it later in another era, right? But it's just coming to a common agreement how we work with that.
So let me pivot slightly to energy innovation, clean energy innovation in particular. When the US Congress passed and President Biden signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act with its many provisions supporting clean energy development across the US, there was a lot of question, as I understand it, in Ottawa about how Canada should respond, and new incentives were put in place and support for innovation was put in place. Now you've got a different macroeconomic circumstance, uncertainty that is arising from the trade wars around the globe, and pressure on budgets. But given Mark Carney's background focusing on the clean energy transition, would you expect that he will be able to sustain budgets for clean energy innovation in Canada? Or do you think that they could be subject to question?
I think between innovation, manufacturing, and deployment, all those areas will be reviewed. And I think on manufacturing, there might be a little bit more pragmatism of, is it realistic for Canada to compete with China, like an example for solar panel production or wind turbine production? Maybe something like batteries would make more sense because of the critical mineral supply chain that we have. On the innovation side, Chris, you might know better than me, but I think we're already pretty far behind the US in terms of the amount of federal money going into innovation. There are some opportunities in center of excellence that the previous government leaned into. For example, CanMet, which in my area on critical minerals is really quite important and could be grown substantially. But and there's CRIN, the Clean Resources Innovation Network. But it's a mixture of federal and provincial funding, and I think there's probably scope under Carney to expand, particularly on the R&D side. But I don't know, Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because we went through a whole generation of half of really close integrated, ever closer economic ties to the U.S. We have a very strong, early research complex, right? Like some of the early breakthroughs in lithium iron phosphate, a lot of the key battery chemistries, a lot of the industrial stuff has been coming out of Canadian universities and Canadian researchers. But the thing is, they very rapidly run out of room to grow, and they almost entirely move to go to the States or go to the appropriate areas in the States where they then get carried up the ladder by venture, ARPA-E, the ARPA programs, what have you, then venture capital and eventually grow. And that's just a chronic part of the productivity problem in Canada. We're missing that middle ladder of how innovative companies grow. The question going forward is, does that model remain? Do we keep doing that? Do we keep generating all this amazing research and new ideas and then send it to the US? Or do we try to build the whole ladder for key areas here? Or do we, participate in, projects with Europe or what have you? And I think working out that whole ladder of how new ideas begin and eventually become technology companies and technologies and then companies, that's going to be a key thing that needs to be worked out in here in Canada, because we're missing all those middle, those key middle sources of finance and willingness to invest in risky ideas and companies.
Well, one recent development that I think caught lots of people's attention, including on this side of the border, was that decision about the BWRX 300, the new smaller reactor. Now, this isn't, kind of fully next generation small modular reactor, but nonetheless an important development. Do you anticipate that nuclear power will be, I mean, Canada's history with nuclear power has been long and well established and very reliable and so forth. Do you anticipate Canada being a place where you see more new civil nuclear technologies emerging going forward?
Yeah, I think that Ontario in particular wants to be a nuclear champion, and
Is that for data center reasons?
Well, I think for the whole economy, I think it's partially climate reasons, partially competitiveness reasons, but also there's a nuclear industry, right? That the
Mhm.
largest nuclear reactor complex in the Western Hemisphere is in Bruce County, Ontario, 6,000 megawatts, right? So there's a supply
Right,
chain that
right
goes
near
into
where
that.
a colleague of mine grew up, as I understand it.
That's right. Yes, and vacations often. But it's a big economic impact on the region, and I think the opportunity to sort of establish SMR as in Canada sort of center of excellence, not just for Canada, but for export, is interesting with the GE Hitachi technology. I'm not an expert in this area, but all I can say is I think one interesting thing for Canada is that you do have these crown-owned utilities, right? So their perspective is a little bit different. They're not as tied to, I mean, there's political sensitivity, but big cost overruns and budget bloats that have been problems for these utilities in the past, certainly. But much like TVA in Tennessee, which is the partner, by the way, for OPG on this new SMR project, they have a little bit of a longer patient capital time horizon, which I think is appropriate for moving these first of a kind technologies into further production and scale. So it's definitely, I think, going to be a priority for Carney, and it's an area where there probably is good support across the country to do more, including on the uranium and fuel cycle side, by the way, which is out west.
Got it. In fact, we haven't talked much about the mineral side of the energy questions, but maybe time is going to box us out there. Look, one more question which I'd be interested to draw both of you out on, and that is areas where you see the greatest positive opportunity for um, Canada-US interactions in the energy sector going forward. Canada will host in just a little bit more than a month, or no, yeah, just a little bit more than a month's time, the G7 leaders in Alberta. Um, Energy issues will be certainly part of that discussion, and there'll be the energy track going on. Where do you see opportunities for constructive and positive dialogue in between Ottawa and Washington at this time?
Well, my quick answer would be, I think, on the opportunities for cooperation, I think the topic of AI, energy for AI, will be of mutual interest. Critical minerals will be of mutual interest, and even gas, I think, which was a bit of a friction point, perhaps, with the previous Liberal government in the first Trump administration. There'll be more alignment this time around, as Chris mentioned earlier. Um, I think the friction will be over climate policy and standards for things like methane intensity, which are important to the Europeans. And then the complete wild card is Russia and Ukraine, right? Which previously had been kind of a core G7 focus that was linked to the gas security angle, but reasons we'll have to go into another call. We're uncertain about where that the U.S. policy is heading on the Russian energy side. So I think there's definitely some areas to cooperation. And I would point to the AI, critical minerals, and gas topics as the most likely.
Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm one of those people where when I started my career, I was kind of anti-nuclear because I came of age during Chernobyl, and I've completely flipped on that. And for a place like Canada where we go through big seasonal changes and solar incidents and wind, we have big wind Dunkel floods and what have you. I think nuclear is going to be one of those natural competitive advantages we have through time, and we have the full fuel cycle, and it's just something is not as controversial as a bunch of things. The wild card I'd put on the table is I think there's a huge potential for cleaning up the oil and gas sector, the GHG intensity, the methane, and doing things like electrifying it. Like CCS is struggling. Maybe we can electrify a lot of it. Like I was at some recent workshops in California where I saw energy storage technologies like I've never seen. Very robust, very simple, likely to be very cheap. They can harvest their energy from wherever, and that's transformative. The oil and gas industry has a lot of heat needs that are not high. There's sort of 50 degrees, 70, 100, 150, and something along those lines could happen, but it's going to take creative policy. So I think sure bet would be nuclear for me. The wild card would be something like electrification of oil and gas, and I agree with on the critical minerals and the AI front with RJ.
Well, guys, we've reached the point where we're going to have to draw things to a close. For the audience, I thank you, first of all, for joining us today. I would draw your attention to the podcast series of the Center on Global Energy Policy, which is called the Columbia Energy Exchange. You can find that the links to that podcast series on our website, which is energypolicy.columbia.edu. And I mention this because there's a very good conversation, actually just from a little bit more than a week ago, that our colleague Bill Lovelace conducted with Professor Andrew Leach from the University of Alberta, also on the topic of Canada's energy policies in the wake of the elections. So if you will, virtually, please join me in thanking RJ Johnston and Chris Bataille for their thoughts in this program today. It's, as we said at the outset, one of our rapid response webinars that we will be doing from the Center on Global Energy Policy. And we really appreciate your time and your interest to join us today. With that, I'm going to sign off. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Chris. Take care, everyone.